Welcome to the Caput Center for Research and Innovation in STEM Education Colloquium series. I am absolutely delighted to be back. This is our first colloquium after the beginning of COVID. I'm not going to say after COVID because it's still going, but after the beginning of COVID. I am glad that we're back, even if we're not in a shared space. And I am delighted to open our colloquium series with Dr. Pratim Sengupta. I hope you will mark your calendars for our other upcoming talks as well. We have Deborah Fields on March 25th, Xandra Di Araujo on April 8th, and Robert Gigier closes out our year on April 29th. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Pratim Sengupta, who is a full professor of learning sciences at the University of Calgary. In addition to his many publications, Dr. Sengupta has also been a successful grant seeker, including receiving an NSF Career Award in 2012. His work has been widely recognized, including by the Banff Center for the Arts and Creativity, which awarded him the Paul D. Fleck Award in 2020. And he is an inducted fellow in the International Society of Design and Development in Education. His public computational works have been installed at Canada's National Music Centre, TELUS Spark Science Center, MoMA, and Contemporary Calgary. In addition, he graciously serves as a co-PI on one of my own grants, and for that I'm very thankful. So please join me in welcoming Pratim to talk about computational science as a complex ethical political pivot in science in STEM education. And because we're on Zoom, we're asking that you hold questions until the end of the talk, and there's time at the end to have conversations. Thank you, Pratim.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is a true honor for me to be here. Jim Caput's work was foundational for me when I was doing my own PhD in the learning sciences. I fundamentally changed by his scholarship on multiplicative reasoning. It ended up becoming a big piece of my algorithmic puzzles. I ended up designing algorithms based on his work that went a long way in taking something that we learned in graduate school all the way down to 5th grade. So this was quite profound for me. Chandra, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be on your grant, and I'm honored to be on the Caput Center Advisory Board, and I'm honored to be here today. Walter, great to see you again, and everyone out here today. Thank you so much for, I never take anyone else listening to my work for granted. And for that, I have the deepest respect for all of you. Thank you for spending your time this way. I'm going to talk about computational science as in terms of heterogeneity and in terms of what it can become as more than code, more than just code, just as in only code, not the just code, more than only code, as ethical political pivots. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an arc of my own journey, just to situate all of you in my my space, my chronotype, sort of. So but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about examples of unfolding code. And as I do that, I'm also going to weave in how I've been able to work with PhD students fairly successfully, from at least from my perspective, to build this scholarship in ways that I'm also learning in the process, along with them through collaboration. And so sorry, I'm just trying to minimize windows so that I can focus on one screen. Even as someone who plays with and designs programming languages, I find Zoom quite challenging actually to use. It's flummoxing. But yeah, so my journey begins with modeling complexity in 1998. I spent my first decade after college, around college, with college, was in physics. I didn't finish that PhD, but I did do a full PhD in learning sciences, but the physics part. But throughout what I've done is I've worked on modeling complex systems. Begins with modeling fractal dimension of filtration membranes to be used by the Indian Navy. And I never lost touch. I try to work with my students to publish in computational science. So one of the more fun projects that we did, and the data fitted almost perfectly, was modeling US elections as oligarchy. And this was published in JAS, the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulations. And then more recently, last year, we published another paper that was a series of computational simulated experiments on modeling intra-colony violence in ant colonies. And the reason I want to start with this is because this is sort of where my heart is. My heart is in the discipline, and everything that, and the reason I'm interested in experience, in studying experience and education, is because it takes me deeper into discipline. Rather than education research often becomes an evaluation of a textbook or evaluation of things that we take granted for discipline. For me, it has been the opposite. How can I cause trouble in discipline when I center human interactions and human experience? Since 2004, I made the shift to learning sciences, and I started, and then I began a long research program, which still continues to this day, where I studied the complementarity of physical, embodied, and computational models. This work initially began focused on students, but within a few months of me hanging out in classrooms, it shifted to centering teachers and teaching. Then more recently, around 2012, 2013, when I was teaching at Vanderbilt, I also realized that it was kind of a lived necessity to integrate social studies with computational science in the classroom. That was a way of unsilencing some very troubling trends that I saw. White teaching candidates, pre-service teachers would not talk about slavery, and it was, I couldn't. It was anyway. Not, I can get lost into that, but just that phenomenon. But that phenomenon prompted me to start looking at computational models of race and racial segregation and ethnocentrism as a way to create sort of a neutral space so that people would have those conversations. And we'll actually talk about that. And I also shifted from doing micro level studies to longer timescale studies. Like, I would hang out in classrooms for years, the same teachers, the same students, preferably for more than 1 year. And I would go in and work with teachers, with my students, once or twice a week throughout the year. And that kind of work really, when you do commit to the realities of the classroom and teaching, it changes you as the researcher, and that happened to me. Since 2013, I've been working at the interface of public and private, not private, but public and classroom spaces. This began with a collaboratory project that ended up being installed at MoMA. But then it really took off when I moved to Calgary, where we started making computational science open and public. We started installing undiluted code and simulations in public spaces. And the idea was that neither students nor teachers, neither young learners, nor parents, nor teachers need to be handheld in a patronizing way, but they can interact with discipline in its more powerful forms. And yes, the trajectory would look different, but the interaction should not be prevented simply because someone thinks the public is not ready for it. And that's so it's a very, very deliberate attempt to break the symbolic hegemony that computing and STEM disciplines have in separating the public from access to the core. And then more recently, I would say, since really, I would say, I mean, the social studies and computational science work that began around 2013 had the ethical and political bent in it, but now it's more explicit in all my projects. Now I have multiple collaborations with sociologists and professors and researchers of medicine, environmental scientists. This is both in Canada and in the US, and we are really now interested in ethical and historical dimensions of deep interactions with code. Not like here is a prefabbed nugget of code that an educator designed for you, but really this is what's happening in discipline. So studies of professionals in discipline, studies of learners and teachers in discipline, as they're engaging with authentic real code, as well as real forms of like, for example, even something as simple as an injection syringe in medicine can actually have a profound impact from ethical and historical dimensions on someone else. But anyway, won't be able to talk all about that, but we'll certainly get to see glimpses of that. So this is, and this book kind of captures, this book just came out last year, almost a year back to this month, came out last year. It's open access from MIT Press. It's a series of empirical chapters with theoretical bookends on either end. And what this is that it at the heart of my work is a critique of technocentrism, which I see as a crisis in computing and STEM education. And let me problematize this first, and then I think we can follow along more easily. Technocentrism is, of course, Pappert's, I think, one of his most important contributions to the field of education and computer science. And he positioned technocentrism as a fallacy of referring all questions about technology to the technology itself. And at the heart of struggles that I have, that have emerged for me through my practice over the last, I would say, since 2004, is this notion that that both the signature of learning is a coded artifact, and even the process of learning is often represented by the work on by actually steps of evolution of the coded artifact. And my pushback against technocentrism is not to deny the importance of these artifacts. In fact, it is to it's somewhat the other direction that we want to study how this artifact gets unfolded in our experiences. And so if the answer to technology should answer to questions about technology should not end or all be centered on technology, then I would just go a step further and say the answers to education and society must also not be oriented toward technology. There is a lot more that's happening. So on your left here is a simple logo program created by a Black girl in an all-Black school in Nashville that I was working with, nearly all-Black school in Nashville, over 90, I think 5% or 99% Black, and this is and I talk about this with my co-authors in Voice and Code. My co-authors are my ex-students Amy Farris and Amanda Dickus. As a misrecognition on my part, where I centered my pedagogical interactions and with the teacher as well as the student to the production and the genesis and the production of this particular simulation, the representation and the code. And what I missed in hindsight was the rich connections with their community that the student was actually centering. And it is this misrecognition that in my experience has kept repeating in my own work. And what happens when we realize that it's not just the code or the representation. There is an entire support system that goes around with it. And Seymour talks about this as infrastructure that is important. But I think it's unfortunately, even the arguments against technocentrism have mostly resulted in the creation of more technological artifacts. And that's the point of crisis here. And so here, here's an example. This is in the same school in a different grade, working. This is an example of a student in 4th grade at the end of a year-long curriculum where the entire engagement was based on one simple problem. We went in twice a week, worked with the teacher in the math period, and the problem was that students are going to draw a square or a triangle, but they're going to do it partly by using code and partly by connecting the code to two sensors, and these are two ultrasonic sensors. They're sensing the distance of the nearest obstacle, and this particular group built so they worked in groups of 2. Each group of 2 built either a pulley system or a racetrack or some form where similar forms where there would be an obstacle that could be sensed by an ultrasonic sensor. One of the sensors would control the turn of the turtle. One of the sensors would control the step size, the distance, the horizontal distance, the vertical distance that the turtle would travel. And using the apparently simple construction, what ended up happening was we ended up spending the entire year on this work, and things got progressively more complex. Initially, what was assumed to be understood conceptually, as soon as students started explaining to others, gaps emerged. Teachers and students then decided, well, let's actually invite teachers who can use this work and let us position students in the position of designing for other users who are real authentic users of this work. And so we brought in teachers, and then it ended up that teachers had to be brought in more than once. The experience of designing for an implicit user, we found, was profoundly different than the presence of the user. And even that gap highlighted for us the importance of the complexity of attending to the complexity of experience. Then that results in the creation of user guides that become progressively more refined. That creates space for the classroom teacher to the homeroom teacher to actually bring in the curricular objectives that they were mandated to use, and the space gets co-opted and lived in by teachers and students, and we, the project PIs, went progressively to the background of the work. And this is also the passing the mantle off, right, to teachers and students. And this is an example of the richness and the heterogeneity of code as experience. What I'm going to talk about today is give 2 more examples of unfolding code that has happened in a bit more public dimension. And the reason I'm skipping more details on the work in classrooms is because you can easily read about it. It's some of my more established work. It's out there. I think they're almost all available freely online. And the book is, of course, open access. What I'm going to talk about now is, unfolding the flocking algorithm. It's a very simple algorithm, and unfolding the ethnocentrism algorithm, which is Schelling's original algorithm of segregation. And what I mean by unfolding, what I mean by unfolding, here's an example. So these 3 lines of code are very simple lines of code that define the shape of an object that is moving, and these 3 lines of code are the 3 parameters of separation, alignment, and cohesion that actually help us both model and understand perhaps how actual flocks form, schools of fish or flocks of birds in nature. And this, of course, was created by Craig Reynolds back in the 80s. Craig ended up winning an Oscar for this, the first Oscar for, I think, Academy Award for Technological Innovation and Advancement in Cinema. Batman, Tron, all the swarming actually comes out of this work on algorithms, on computer graphics. And the simple algorithm, when we unfolded it over it's almost 7 years now that we've been doing this work with the same algorithm. So many different forms of installation. This is DigiPlay on your left. That's a set of 3 screens that we have, giant screens, 80-inch screens, touch screens, multi-touch screens that we have installed at the University of Calgary. And what you're looking at here is a teacher who has brought their students, second graders, over here. And there's a beautiful story that unfolds at the end of 2 hours of the teacher just hanging out with the students. And one of, I think I was there and someone else from my lab was there facilitating some of the conversations. At the end of these 2 hours, the students decide that they're going to make code invisible. They did a lot of changes to the code, and then they decided to make it invisible. So they ended up figuring out how RGB color schemes were implemented in the code. And they meticulously turned all the moving objects, the voids on screen, to the exact same color as the background. And so at that point, I asked them, it took them about a half hour to just do that simple change on each screen. And as they were doing it, they were all engaged, and I asked them, why are you doing this? And they said, oh, because that's power. It's like a password I'm using. It's a secret. It's my secret. All these changes that we're making, there's so much going on, but you cannot see anything. And so, that to me is, excuse me, that really stood as a moment of, to me, it stood as a moment of recognition of the power, what happens when we turn over what we held very sacred in discipline, we turned that over to students. It wasn't the algorithm, it wasn't the flocking algorithm that ended up being the key player in their interaction. It was something else, and it's this difference, that becomes very important. Here is an example: Voices Celebration. This is an invited installation at Canada's National Music Centre. What happens here is 14,000 people interacted with the simulation in one day. Free admissions. I don't have the video lined up here, but throughout the day, what we saw was the people would actually stand in front of a microphone and talk to the voids. The voids would they could record a song or a story onto a single computational object on the screen, and that object would play the songs to itself. We call it a silent disco moment. And they would, and the movement of the void would interact with the frequencies of the recorded audio. And so what we ended up seeing was people singing not just the Canadian national anthem, but also azans, which are Islamic chants and prayers, Bollywood songs, songs from classic oldies from the 40s, from the 50s, and people kept coming back. And this is another kind of interaction with code. And when people who were, let's say, a parent and a child kept doing that, we saw very interesting kinds of interaction. The parent would actually sing songs, and the child and the parent would then, and here is what you can see here is actually a mother and children hanging out with someone from the lab and interacting with another laptop here that we had positioned with just, it's a hole in the wall. Here's the code. Here is how what you're seeing on the screen works, right? So these are hybrid constructions as pedagogical spaces. And then this is the Science Museum, where we have a permanent installation. you can try to drive the flock here, and then you can actually code the flock and hack the flock here. And this is another example where, the first day we ever opened up the coding installation at the museum. This is Mary. Mary was 9 years old, roughly, I think. At that time, Mary hung out with us for 2 hours. And her goal was to, because it was a flat, at that time we were playing with a tabletop, and Mary wanted to turn the flock of boids to an aquarium of minnows, which is a favorite fish. And so she squished the triangles, but that squishing meant that she had to hang out with us and she loved hanging out with us for 2 hours, just like we would hang out in the lab and when we had a hard problem to solve. And this is an example of, and there's a lot of interesting stuff mathematically happening in terms of gestures and embodied cognition as she's squishing, as she's figuring out the math along with us of that squish, what that means for angles and the algorithms. And anyway, so this is a little video, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So Marie-Claire Shanahan, my colleague with whom I've developed this work, Marie-Claire and I, we call this boundary play. It is the experience of code as a public artifact, and Seymour talks about code as a public artifact, but this is really taking that public, not just in a more shorthand sense. A public artifact would simply be any external representation that we create and that can be interacted on by others in the world. But this is taking publicness seriously. And these are playful excursions through the use of pivots, right? So the shape of the void is a triangle, but it's also a minnow, and it becomes a pivot. It can swivel a learner from a disciplinary world to the lived-in world. And we can include our intuitive knowledge. We can include learning with friends and families. A lot can happen here. And so these are kind of unexpected ways that allow us to make ourselves into characters in a figured world of I'm hanging out and hacking with a bunch of computer folks, right? And it's that sense of belongingness that we can create. It's an entry and an invitation into a space that is usually typically closed off to public. Another example, this is from our paper that was published in 2017 in the International Journal of Engineering Education. And here's an example of a parent-child interaction where the child actually ends up creating a glitch, what the child calls a glitch in the code, a whole bunch of voids just circling like this. And the mother comes in and says the voids are bonking into each other. And then what unfolds over the next several minutes is a very amazing conversation about overcrowding of voids to a glitch in the code to overcrowding in prisons. And again, that's an example of how a little glitch became a pivot into both understanding, thinking more deeply about the mathematical relationships and the computational abstractions, as well as a bigger social engagement with something that's very difficult to talk about. There is an example of, part of this work now is recognized as public art. This is what happened in the Paul D. Fleck art. We had an art residency recognized by this award that this award funded in 2019. I'm just going to play, I don't know if you can hear the sounds, but I'm going to play the video and you will get a sense of this, what happens when we really scale this up. The other part of publicness is the sheer scale of projection and the sheer possibility of immersion into public worlds. And this is, we are projecting on what we were told at that point was the largest indoor screen in Western Canada and the second largest in Canada. So this was a space where we had two simulations of flocking, one that engages the audience through their bodies. They strut, dance, move. Those interactions are sensed by sensors, and those sensors speak to communicate with the boys and on screen. And then the other part is actually work that is led by my student Dylan Perret, who's now a PhD candidate, and they actually took the flocking algorithm and redesigned it in order to, flocking simulation and algorithm, redesigned it to represent normative and non-normative institutions, energies of the non-normative voids get sapped if they're closer to normative institutions, and they were trying to represent queer trans harm and resilience, not as individual level experiences, but as multi-level interactions between individuals and systems like institutions or a group of people, normative people who often bully non-normative people. And this paper, first version of this paper was published in ICLS 2020 as a full paper. You can, it's called, I believe it's called Queering Complexity. And then the second is Dylan's sole authored chapter in Oxford Research Encyclopedia, where Dylan is making an argument for queering, offering some provocations and arguments for how to queer computing and computing education. And what happens here is that as people start interacting with the simulation and the code in facilitated spaces, they're able to identify affectively with the perceived plight of a void on the screen. They start rooting for, they start cheering for people. And by the way, this work is not just happening in Canada. We also partnered with, I have a NSF project with the University of Maryland at College Park, and we have also worked with teachers in their local school district to do this work. And this can become a very productive space for professional learning for not just computing education, but also reorienting computing education toward more critical and socially necessary conversations. Other examples of student work, this is Dr. Stephanie Laddick. Stephanie defended her dissertation last year, now a postdoctoral fellow in information science. Stephanie's big contribution was Stephanie identified facilitation and centered the work that facilitators do as central to this kind of boundary play. That's especially in institutional contexts. And she identifies this notion of infrastructuring. It's a notion first proposed by Lee Starr and Ruler, the classic paper, I think in 1998, where they're talking about infrastructure, not as infrastructure objects, but also as whens. More importantly, as whens. Whens are breakdowns in the infrastructure between the different parts that constitute the infrastructure. An example here is that my experience in a space like Hack the Flock, which is at the Science Museum, and this is where Stephanie and Bashak and I and Marie Claire have spent hours trying to understand how learning is happening in this space without necessarily intervening. And through that, we realize that what needs to happen is we need to recognize moments where facilitators are acting not just to pressures, they're not just responding to the interaction in hand, they also have implicit institutional pressures of how long they're supposed to spend, where they have to go, what is the implicit expectation in that particular space, and all these, and their own pedagogical inclinations and intentions. So then, all of a sudden, again, this goes beyond code and coding, right? Another example, Bashak Helvici-Ozgur, who's a PhD candidate, soon to finish. Bashak and Stephanie did a beautiful study where they looked at how even pre-verbal children were being centered through interactions between parents, facilitators, and the child and the exhibit. And even when initially parents were hesitant, and this is not there's not forcing a child into a world that they're not ready for. It's the opposite. It truly is an experience of finding oneself in a space that is unexpected, and being able to meaningfully communicate with the child. And the best part is the child actually responding and communicating back and responding to, and that those interactions being centered by parents. And so these are rich micro-interactional analysis. So the moment to moment is still important, but we have to go beyond that. We have to think institutionally, historically, and that's the I'm going to take us to the next story. Chandra, how am I doing with time?
It's 4:40, so however much time you want to leave at the end, you have about
Okay.
20 minutes total.
20 minutes. So maybe I'll take 5 more minutes, and then we can move to Q&A. 5 or 10 more minutes. And so the work on segregation, this begins in 2012. I've never lived in the South before. 2009, I moved to the South, and all of a sudden I realized, that history is not the same. There is no one history. There are many histories. And we are teaching. We can't get people to open up about race. And it is a problem. It is a problem because we can't talk about data of certain kinds that we want to use to engage learners, pre-service teachers in particular. At Vanderbilt, at that point, they were almost exclusively white. I'm layering that with a very clear trajectory of migrant populations. And in Canada, at least, migrant populations are clearly increasing. In Europe too. US, it's a little different. But what we do know empirically is that diversity in US classrooms have gone up, but diversity in teaching has not. And that is an empirical fact. And the key theme here I want to highlight is that we started playing with Schelling's algorithms of racial segregation, which ended up getting Schelling a Nobel Prize in economics, I believe in 2000s. But the work was done really way back in the 60s, and then gained more popularity in the 80s when the book came out. And then it actually became a very powerful algorithm in political science with Axelrod and Hammond talking about that algorithm, taking that algorithm and modeling ethnocentric phenomena. And then that became big because then business scholars started using that model to model consumer behavior. And that's the power of code. This generalizability is the power of code. What we ended up realizing is that, so there is this very neutral representation, that's the von Neumann neighborhood. I know this as a statistical physicist. It's a very simple neighborhood, near-neighbor interactions. It gives us a template for looking at near-neighbor interactions. Schelling, Hammond, Axelrod, and then my advisor, Ruth Belensky, actually implements this code in NetLogo, and before that in StarLogo T, I believe, where they map Schelling's interactions, what Schelling called the calculus of contingent decisions. Very prisoner's dilemma-like trade-off and simple trade-off based analysis of whether I'm going to cooperate with my next neighbor or not. And there are 4 possible strategies. I'm not going to go into that, but there's ethnocentric strategies, cosmopolitan strategies, and these are the 2 extreme opposites. Ethnocentrics only collaborate with, interact with people of their own kind, and cosmopolitans will only interact with people, cosmopolitans will interact with people of all other kinds. And I think they also are known as Stratorious agents in some parts of the literature, where they actually don't interact with their own kind, but only interact with other kinds. And this is where things started becoming interesting for us. We found that, so a big finding in the simulation is if you let it run, and hopefully you'll get to see this here too, is that even if the simulation starts out with an equal distribution of all kinds of strategies, over time, the simulation based on these interactions and shows a very clear pattern of ethnocentric formations. It's almost as if it is a very real model of what happens in societies. And we published a paper in Cognition Instruction in 2018 with Andy Hostetler and Ty Hollett. And we and a revised version of that analysis is there in chapter 5 in Voice and Code, where I talk about transitional othering. It's a pedagogical approach for inviting students into conversations about race, segregation, and migration through, rather than putting my own experiences at stake, I'm going to talk about the hypothetical, somewhat hypothetical, but also partly real and personal experiences of a computational object on the screen. And Seymour talks about this as the power of agent-based computing, logo-like computing, as the turtle becomes Winnicott's transitional object, right? But it's not just an object that is mine, it's also the self and the other. And in this case, othering, as in Edward Said's othering, becomes really important. It allows me to understand the experiences of that object, not just as me, but also as the other who I cannot be, right? And this was very successful for us in Nashville. Mostly white classroom. What we found was that if we brought in another map, a one-dot map of race, where just like the outcome of the ethnocentrism simulation, this map shows the heavily segregated structure of a geographical space in the US. Around the center of the cities, it's more cosmopolitan. As we move far away, it's more and more ethnocentric. And what we found that was that, you know, in a social studies, human geography classroom where everyone's in training to be a social studies teacher, they actually are able to talk about really difficult conversations and even progressively take on more critical stances about, for example, how they would teach zoning or how they would talk about civil rights, right? As they're interacting with the simulation and the map at the same time. And so they're, and I'm leaving out all the more technical elements of the analysis. You can find those in the paper. And this is, and then the next level of the next form of the study actually begins in Canada around 2017, when we started installing different versions of the ethnocentrism simulation in the public space at UC. And what we found was code really becomes an ethical political pivot as immigrant students of color and immigrant folks start interacting with the simulation. So then it becomes, so then in a simple assumptions in the simulation, for example, the rate of migration or the rate of immigration, it's a simple slider, or the definition of what we call is Stratorious behavior. All these things become profoundly affective and moral dimensions of experience, lived experiences of students of color. And this is an example where, and this has been published now in Qualitative Studies in Education very recently, where the facilitator, who is themselves an immigrant of color, is talking about how painful it is, but to give up one's own culture as an explanation of Stratorious behavior for immigrants. How painful it was for them to give up certain parts of their what they were used to doing in their home country when they moved to Canada, because they knew that the implicit expectation was they had to do that in order to get accepted in the new society. Over time, what happens is we see a major solidarity between Dennis, who is a marginalized but still a white Canadian person, and this facilitator who's an immigrant of color, and they decide that they do not want new immigrants to become more cosmopolitan or Stratorious, that they wanted to alter conditions and the code so that immigrants remain ethnocentric. They did not want immigrants to lose their culture. And this is the reversal. This is the reversal of the original intent of the code, right? And this is, and that to me was, that's a moment where, as someone who had a hand in shaping that code, I felt changed in the moment. And this is, so this is the space where I am at currently, looking at algorithms, not just as symbolically powerful and mathematically generalizable, but also as entrenched in the neutral white gaze. It questions key notions such as intentionality. Like what is an intentional act if an agent is being forced to help others? We saw this in the Nashville study, by the way. Students began to talk about forcibly enslaved folks in the South as if they were agents on the screen, then they would talk about them as, oh, they must be cosmopolitan because they can't help themselves. They're unable, they don't have the resources to help themselves, but everyone else is benefiting from others. That is an example of what Pierre Bourdieu would talk about as symbolic violence, where that language hides the suffering and foreground something else that's algorithmically valuable, but not necessarily a good representation of the history of suffering. And so then voice encode could become, one way of thinking of voice encode is unsilencing the private language of pain and humiliation. And people's racialized emotions are at play. It was in play when the facilitator in a couple of slides back was talking about their pain of giving up their own cultural traditions in order to be accepted in a new white society. But again, the trade-off here is that these are conversations that are now happening in a computational science classroom with multi-agent systems that didn't happen before. So the agent is and can be both the self and the other, provided we offer the appropriate supports and scaffolding. Final slide. What I wanted to leave you with are really earnest invitations to not ignore the symbolic intricacies and mathematical depth that computational science can offer, but really looking at experience, the complexity of experience around it, and what that might mean for the disciplinary core in the context of STEM education. What if coding is framed as centering stories from the margins of discipline and society, pre-verbal children, immigrants of color, teachers who are hesitant and afraid to talk about powerful issues because they have not been given the support so far. Coding as intergenerational interactions of centering and decentering learners. One of the most interesting findings in Bashak and Stephanie's work has been that within a single interaction, someone could be both centered and decentered, right? And it's not just simply a matter of listening or doing as or doing with. It's more complex than that. What does it mean to understand these interactions? Coding as acts of critical and Southern reorientation of neutral algorithms that are entrenched in privileged Western and white gazes. We talk about this in the qualitative studies in education paper. What happens if we take caste seriously? Can we even represent the horror that Brahmins in India have generationally, prehistorically, since prehistory has been inflicting on Dalit Indians and lower caste Indians and people who have been forcibly put in this situation, and that control is maintained through social structures that still persist to this day? Can models of segregation even represent that pain? And I speak as one of the oppressors, one of the historical oppressors in that group, right? So the point here is not to absolve myself. The point here is for myself to be changed in this moment. That I think is important. That's how discipline can be changed and should be changed. Coding then also could be seen as unfolding a characters through centering their pain, histories, and labor, and coding beyond representationalism, beyond the primacy of representations to the complexity of experience and the historical arc of disciplines in society that we're entrenched in. Thank you very much. Sorry if I ran over a little bit, but here are links, and I'm happy to communicate even after the talk is over about them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pratim. We have time for a few questions. Sheila already has her hand up, so I'll go ahead and let her ask away.
I'm sorry, I had to take a call, but I missed the last part, which is probably the critical stuff that I really wanted to hear. But I am so excited to hear this lecture. I had read about the little girl and the Boyds and how she kind of converted them into fish and stuff. It was very exciting. I just loved it. And I love the idea of that whole interactive thing. And you did mention something about embodied cognition, which I'm a little familiar with. And I was just wondering if you're familiar with Chalmers and Clark's extended mind, and the way you were talking about the interactivity of, you know, the coding and the public display and everything. It really got me excited. And I was thinking about like cognitive offloading and sort of, you know, that kind of language that's coming about with this whole embodied thing. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, and so all of those are relevant and directly mappable onto what I said, and my concern has been, and this is also critical of my own past work in the field, that it's easy for us to bring in these theoretical connections, talk about the object on the screen as an extended mind, talk about a gesture as an extended mind, right? And then what we end up doing is we end up adding to the capital in the field, which serves us. And the call for publicness is the opposite. And the call for publicness is to move away from the arc of theorizing, but to use the power of theories to build more stronger and resilient and more open and social ways of reimagining education for me. So for me, it's a political moment that we're in. As someone who has been, you know, my first language is English. My mother tongue is supposed to be something very different. And it's, I live that. I live that violence every day. It's, for me, it is, and those 2 points are related. I would love to talk about the extended mind. I would love to talk about the gestural unfolding of code. But rather than talking about it, what I want to happen is I want people to do it. I want people to do it, and then I'm ready to make a deal with myself that maybe they don't have to talk about my theory if I create these public infrastructures. Mm-hmm. If I can find these systems of support, then all of this will be happening. All of this will be happening. I know Shaknoza has been a very dear friend to me for many years, and Shaknoza and I have daydreamed about what if we came to, well, you're in Dartmouth. What if this could happen in Dartmouth? We could collect stories of the community over an entire year, and then we could actually paint the town with guerrilla versions of projected simulations of people's stories. Right, and that to me, that and just the work that would lead up to it would be more powerful than we could accomplish in a coding for dummies or the coding for all kind of thing. And that's intergenerational. We're going to find diversity. We're going to center voices, and it takes the profs out of the university, and that's what I want. The walls to break down, and that's so yes to everything that you're saying, but I want to break the walls down.
Okay, thank you.
And I think we have time for one more question. Beste has her hand up.
Thanks. So, lower hand. We know that STEM is historically a political discourse rather than an academic discourse. Yes, but we have adapted it in quite haste, particularly in the last 10 years, although the first origination of the term is around early 2000s. So now academy is part of this STEM mania. And we also know, based on the original discourse of STEM, coding, the traditional considerations about code and coding operate within frames of scientism and technocratic orientation, and for those kinds of purposes. So I do understand the perspective you're trying to bring here, but I find it important to go back to the layers of code, because I felt like today you talked about coding, which is an active experience of generating the code. The code is essentially an object, a disciplinary one, a representational one. And there is this visual space that does not represent the code, in a way, as you said, hides the code through power or whatever it is. And this thing that I'm looking at, maybe a beautiful picture, etc. So I saw in your talk, I felt your theoretical or personal attachment to sociocultural perspectives towards activities of coding, and also the context of coding, potentially being social, racial, personal, historical, narrative-based. But I want to ask you, what is your take on code itself as object, either as a representational one or a disciplinary one? In other words, is code itself a narrative? Is that a story, or is it a tool for us to get to a story? And I understand this question is theoretical, and I listened to your response to Sheila's question very carefully, but I think spending time to think about what code is, not coding, and for what reason we are coding, code may still be important. In other words, ontological perspectives on coding may have important pedagogical implications for our students is one of the claims. So what is your take on that? How do you view code itself as an object at the disciplinary level, from the perspective of the student, and at the pedagogical level?
Yeah, so right off the bat, let me say something that I'm not going to expand on a whole lot because it's there in the QSE paper. A lot of the questions that you're asking are answered, especially the relationship, my trouble with the ontology, with computational ontologies, which is a distinct thing in computer science, with computational ontologies, but it's also ill-defined, and but at the same time it's real because there are entailments of particular assumptions and particular ways of naming
which bleed
things.
into pedagogical
Right.
ontologies as well, right?
Yeah. And so I think representational dexterity cannot solve everything. And in that dimension, I think I'm at a point of asking more questions than answering them. And the second half of the QSE paper actually foregrounds scholarship by Dalit scholars in India. One particular scholar who has profoundly influenced my understanding of migration is Gopal Guru. And Gopal Guru talks about migration as a moral protest. So migration is not something that we are doing just as an economic trade-off, which is at the heart of Schelling's algorithm. But we are doing it as a moral protest, especially if we are subaltern and subjugated historically. And when I just that fundamental, to me, that's an ontological moment, but it's also an axiological challenge to ontology. That it is a challenge that centers values, not just a trade-off, right? And a values and history over an economic and a mathematical trade-off. But when I do that, then can the calculus of contingent decisions, which in microeconomic theory is known as, imperfect, people operating in under conditions of imperfect information. We can sum all of this up succinctly, mathematically, by saying, oh, we're in that realm of imperfect information. Is it really? Is it really?
Yes,
right?
Really, yes.
And
but the other more important, I think, I wonder, because the way I see it, unfolding code itself is an important aspect of unfolding everything about social life and political life through the code. But they're related but separate activities. So I wondered if you also considered of the code itself as a representation or as an object is equally important in the pedagogy in relation to computer science or not. That was
yes, absolutely. And I think that is what happens in computer science labs. That is what happens when a code is being written. So in chapter 5 of Voice in Code, we do this review of how the computational science has developed in the context of models of ethnocentrism. And what we identify there is that the way models got better and improved was through progressive recontextualization. So the little algorithm gets recontextualized once. We get model A, we get Hammond and Axelrod. It gets recontextualized again. We got another paper by Soham Dey and colleagues that came out in 2015, who basically show that when you really play with immigration and really go and make changes that are fundamental to the algorithm in profound ways that affect immigration, the trend of ethnocentric becoming lessens. That's a pretty interesting finding.
Mhm.
But that happens because they were matching the model with some of the data on migration, historical
Mhm.
migration,
Mhm.
right? And
One
so
of my
even that
concerns
is,
is,
so that is also an example of unfolding. Another example of unfolding is what is happening now. So typically, one way in which I unfold code is through different PhD students, and they take me to different places of unfolding. Right now, code on racial segregation is being unfolded in 3 different ways in my lab. So I have a student who's unfolding code through unfolding the same algorithm through trying to reposition reading code, which you were mentioning, right? Juxtaposing that with reading novels of migration.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
The richness of the experiences, right, in both cases, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
what is it that moves us when we are reading particular parts of the code? How does that contradict, or how does that resonate with parts of reading the novel? How do we then change the code to reflect some of the more affective dimensions?
Mhm.
And the other student is literally working at the representational layer of modeling micro interactions, ethical moments of micro interactions with technologies through the use of cinematic animations.
Mhm.
Using hand sketches to do the equivalent of camera work, then incorporating those movies as part of the code. What would code need to be in order to represent those movements? And also, what does it mean to connect one animation to the next? Do we connect them through a flocking algorithm? Do we connect them through a trade-off algorithm, right? And just maybe opening that space up for redesign, for co-design. Another student is working on looking at algorithms of credit scoring in community with recent immigrants, because their lives are extremely deeply affected by those algorithms that are invisible, right? And so to me, this is the answer to your question is through more research, but also a fundamental challenge to ontology through centering values and axiological concerns from the margin.
Thanks.
And with that, I'm going to close today's colloquium and thank everybody for coming. And thank you to Pratim for giving us a lot to think about.
Thank you.
So we could all give Pratim another round of applause.
And thank you so much for spending this hour with me.
Yes, thank you.
Should I stay in this room for the informal
So are we
chat?
moving to another room?